I'm going to invite you as the first part of this interview and conversation today to just tell me a little bit about yourself. And that can be about you as a person, as an entrepreneur, just as a human being. But who are you?
Hello, my name is Mangda Sengvanhpheng, and I am based in New York City. And my background is as a mixed media artist, and I've always been in the mystical and healing arts. And a lot of those elements have all been woven into my grief and death work. I also am just a very curious person, and I love traversing all these different parts of life. So that's where I'm showing up today.
Thank you. And thank you for putting that little caveat. I think it's really important sometimes to think about the fact that who we are, how we show up, what we're bringing into conversations like this is different every single day, every single minute. Thank you for that reminder. Can you share a little bit further about your work and your company and what you do and provide to community?
What I do is I support individuals, communities, companies, even through grief and loss. And the way in which I approach it is really to renew our engagement to life. So, just really stressing the importance of us going into these difficult and challenging life experiences that are inevitable. So, I facilitate grief groups, offerings, education, experiences to educate, understand, be supported by. And um, yeah, I also do different products to meet you where you're at in your grief and loss, and a little bit of everything. Yeah.
In a really beautiful way.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. And we'll get to that a little bit later, just about how many angles your work sort of supports people from. And before that though, I want to talk about the name of your company. So BACII, the name of your company, is inspired by a Laotian style of ceremony that's often held, you told me in another interview, as a part of a funeral. And so, can you briefly walk me through an experience that you've had at one of these ceremonies? I know the first time that you experienced one was at a funeral. And can you share about how that experience of walking through that ceremony impacted your journey toward death care today?
Sure. So Bossy itself loosely translates to blessings in Laotian, and that's where my family's from. And the first time I experienced it was a funeral, and the whole idea of experiencing a Bossy ceremony is it could be very elaborate, where there's monks and there's like days of chanting, and there's all of these beautiful, beautiful like centerpieces and adornments. Or it can be very, very simple, person to person. And the whole idea is you wrap a white string around someone else's wrist and you give them a blessing from your heart. So it's really a life affirming act and ritual. It really symbolizes connection and community. And, you know, there's also this idea that there's so many parts of us, and it's a way in which to bring it all together through these blessings to make you more whole. And so you could do this at birth, you could do this at death, you could do this in illness, any kind of celebration. And I just think it's so beautiful because one, like that was the first time I did experience it was at a funeral, and to bring that into like my life and death work is really just, you know, it all goes full circle for me with that. And a very beautiful experience that I had was actually recently when I was in Laos. I had the opportunity to visit the villages that my family had all come from and quite frankly had to escape from. And so there was days of preparation for this Bossy ceremony where the whole village came through to create all of these parts of these rituals, from like handmade, hand poured candles, like hand cut strings, like just very, very long form practices to create this. And I was in tears because, like, I had just elders, children, all of these individuals coming up and just wishing me all these blessings. So my wrists were just covered in white strings. And it's just one of the highlights of my life yet to have experienced that.
And how do you I can say from experiencing just being in the room with you, having conversations with you about your work, I feel this level of care and attention to what you do and how you support people. And it sounds like maybe that thread comes from inspiration in these ceremonies and rituals. And so I'd love to have you expand on sort of how specifically those types of ceremonies have influenced how you carry out the work that you do, how you show up for people, how your offerings are created and formed.
Because my life and death work and the grief work is influenced by these rituals and ceremonies. It's really rooted ancestrally and the ways in which that I grew up and my bloodlines, and also what these ceremonies and rituals symbolize, this connection, this community, this care, is what I value so deeply. And what I do with every part of BACII is with so much intention, with so much care, with so much love, honestly. And I try and do that with everything, which takes time. That takes a lot of time, which is a bit counteractive. It almost feels a little bit of a rebellion sometimes in our very fast-paced world, and we don't really get as much as this TLC. And I know that I really want to bring that into this world, and I really want that to be felt with everyone that is interacting with my work or engaging with it or experiencing it.
Just such an important perspective and way to engage with the work that we do, which is dealing with people at their most vulnerable, sometimes broken, challenging, exhausted moments and experiences in their life. Why wouldn't we be almost, in my mind, like inspired and obligated to hold them in a way that feels tender and slow and thoughtful and loving and caring, like you're talking about? Like, all of those words feel very aligned with the purpose of this work. And I just want to say again, like, I feel it so clearly in the way that you just show up and move through the world. So the intention that you have, I think, is reflected in how you show up. And one of my, my next question is, so you grew up with these experiences in influences from both Eastern and Western cultures, and I'd love to hear you talk about how that's made your understanding of and relationship to death and mortality richer. And how is navigating two cultures with very different approaches, like you're talking about, these ways that can be often very slow and caring and beautiful, and on the other side of the fence, transactional and dry and operational. How is navigating those two approaches and beliefs around death helped you develop and reach a place that you're standing today with mortality and death and life? Because you always put that, you're like, you do life and death work. So yeah.
I have a very holistic approach to everything, and I think this connects also a little bit from this last question and this, in terms of what I am doing through this work and how I'm showing up, is quite frankly what I wish I had experienced when I was experiencing so intimately the end of life. So I've experienced loss throughout my entire life, but what really brought me to this work was being so intimate with the various end of life industries that I had to navigate alone. And there wasn't a lot of TLC or support or guidance or anything that I really needed at that time. So that's really what I'm doing with BACII, is really creating and cultivating that kind of support and mindfulness and thoughtfulness in these most tender, sensitive, challenging, even potentially life changing experiences. Because again, like, this world and the systems and the industries that we're navigating, unfortunately, like, there's not enough of this human component to be held through these experiences. And so yeah, that's a huge part of why BACII exists, is to do that, to counteract the lack of time for tenderness and support.
As you have done this work and also had your own personal experiences, how did these various influences and different perspectives on death and how we should approach it make your relationship to death richer?
Just pulling a little bit more on the Eastern Western, raised by my Lao father. And so just these seemingly little things, but huge cultural influences, where him and I would talk about death throughout my entire life. Like, we would talk about spirit world. We would talk about all of these things that were very normalized. We talked about impermanence for as long as I could remember. It's very normalized for me to hear these messages of, like, life is impermanent. Like, what do you want to do? And I feel so grateful to him, because his values is, quite frankly, like, very different, I think, than a lot of our Western ways, in terms of, like, you need to make a lot of money and you need to do these things. It's just like, what does your heart want to do? Like, what do you want to do? Like, what is feeding you? What makes you happy? And I think just having someone foster those conversations and normalizing it, and anything that I'd be really curious about or like out there about, like it wasn't judged. So I think that really has influenced a lot of my life and work, because that's not what's common in our Western culture. It's not common to be really talking about impermanence, you know, and like your mortality and even spirit world or ancestors or anything like that. So for me, that duality was very obvious and contrasting, and I feel so grateful to have that contrast so I can really be authentic and true to my perspectives and the way in which that I want to meet people.
What's been really interesting about this work that we've all been doing together and the conversations we've been having is a lot of us had these interactions. We had conversations with people who allowed us to be ourselves, who allowed us to talk about the things and pushed us to talk about the things that a lot of other people don't want to talk about and have a lot of conversations that folks don't want to have. In creating your work and creating these spaces that you hold for people, what's it been like to have people who need that kind of support meet you in those conversations that they might not be able to have with anyone other than you?
I'm so sure that a lot of folks that have been doing this work have had a similar experience, but for me, I continue to say it brings me to my knees. Like, I genuinely feel like it's such an honor to be that person with someone else or to witness someone else, and to know that they feel safe enough to begin to explore those conversations is, again, like I hold it with such reverence, you know, and with such care, because I know what that means. And especially in this world, if you don't have anyone else and you become that person, like that's a big responsibility, you know, and that should be really honored as such. And that's the way in which that I meet it. And it really, I feel like all this work, navigating the fears or the curiosities or witnessing the transformations or changes through tending to your grief or exploring the end of life or preparing for it, or, you know, all the ways in which that I personally love to meet people through this work, it breaks my heart open. You know, everything. It makes me feel, quite frankly, so alive. Like that is, it's kind of funny almost thinking about that with all this stuff. Is like, it makes me feel the most alive when I like with people, you know, in these spaces.
When we think about the fact that like we are here in these moments, we are alive, we have these opportunities to talk about these things and plan for what happens to us at death and after death, like it's a really amazing opportunity to feel good about it and to feel good about something that often, which is my next question, holds a lot of fear and a lot of physical and emotional tension. And so, in another interview that we did, I asked your advice for folks who are interested in working with you. And you said, if you're curious, follow that over the fear. And the word fear comes up in how you frame your work and how you talk about what you're inviting people in to do with you. So, I'm really curious to have you share two things. One is how your own experience with fear has changed or shaped around death. And I'll ask the second question after that. So, what is your relationship to fear and sort of why has that been important for you to have as part of the language you use when talking about doing this work?
Didn't even think about it until right now in this moment when you're speaking. And the memory that comes up for me was my parents, specifically my mother. She was very much scared of so much of the world. And I just remembered witnessing how much she did not do in her life because of fear. And I think that that has had such a great influence on me, because I had been very driven to go towards fear, and that has expanded my life in ways that I can't even begin to describe. And from where I come from, by leaning into that fear and with practice with anything else, it's been a practice, quite frankly, of um, acknowledging where the fear is and going towards it and finding whatever tools or support that I need to do um, to do that thing. And with that practice, just with so many of us that like go towards your fears, like you begin to kind of have this like fear muscle, you know, that's getting like stronger and stronger, and you keep going and you keep going. So for me, I think witnessing my mother and her life, and for me being like, okay, like I have to just do the scariest things. I have to keep doing that. And quite frankly, that's what's brought me to death work too, also, is like, it's scary. It's like I go towards, I think, what has been scary in my life. my entire life, and I continue to do so. And I continue to see where it has been extremely beneficial and expansive and exhilarating at the same time, you know? There's so much that is on the other side of that that I can personally attest to that is worth it. So I think that's why I probably talk a lot about it without even realizing it.
Yeah, and that piece I think that you just said about there's something on the other side of it. And this is something that, my second question is, so you talk about the fact that working with this fear in relation to death and mortality isn't just about overcoming it. It's not just about getting on the other side of it. But as you're speaking about, and as you write about, you use this word illuminating. And you say like illuminating your fear. It's very different from just power in
Totally.
my mind. And if I'm reading this right, it's very different
Mhm.
from powering through it, getting on the other side, and then being released of it, which I'm like, is that even really possible with all the fears in our life? So I'd love to hear you expand a little bit on that language specifically of illuminating and what that experience of working with you and the work that you do around death and fear and illumination.
Yes, I think I feel very drawn to it because, again, going towards what's scary or unknown or even dark, like if we're using colors, honestly, it's kind of like when you're speaking, I'm thinking about the idea of like entering a room. It's like maybe you have to get to the other side of that room, or like you're curious or you want to see what's on the other side, but like you need to turn on the light. You know, like we just need to shine a light on these things. And what happens when we turn on a light, or like it's showing us what's there? And so I think the more that we avoid and the more that we don't go and shine a light on things, like the more that those spaces grows, and maybe that fear grows and that anxiety around it grows. And so when I think of illumination, I mean, honestly, I think of moonlight, I think of like literal lights, I think of ways in which to shine on something. And yeah, I think it's also connected to my name and also just how I've moved through the world as a pretty, spacious, light person and warm person. And going towards those spaces in life, it becomes less scary and anxiety producing.
Mm, yeah, I have this vision of, for me, whenever I'm home alone and it's just now me and just a baby and my husband's not here, I sleep with extra lights on in the house. And it is exactly what you're talking about, where it's like, if I can see it, I don't dwell on what might be there. And that is a really interesting sort of relationship to build around death, is if we can get our questions answered, if we can look at it, if we can examine it, if we can see it, if we can understand by working with folks like you, okay, this is like maybe what's going to happen. Here are your options. Here's how we can guide you through it. Here's how it could be experienced. Having that light on in the whatever the room where you're having that conversation just feels so incredibly, it feels almost like when I go to bed at night and the lights are on in the house, I'm like, I'm not tense because whatever's over there, I'm going to see it. And I think that's really just a really special way, and that word feels so specific and just incredible to use. And thank you for explaining, because I'm like, I feel like there's a reason that this feels so right. It really does. So yeah, thank you. I want to know how you want people to feel as they plan for the end of their lives. And then my follow-up question for that is, how do you want people to feel as they are experiencing the end of their lives?
I think I can relate feelings to both of them, which it really much is. It goes down to I want people to feel extremely cared for, extremely supported, heard, listened to, held, encouraged. I want, in terms of the planning process, to be able to give them as much information and resources and options as possible so they can make the decisions in which that they want. And before even doing that, being held in that discomfort of everything that comes up when you are trying to plan for the end of one's life. I mean, there's so much that is emerging that's beyond the practical. Like, really, I think more than anything, it's being held in the emotional. Um, so there's that. It's just making sure that people feel extremely held through it, and then also just having so much information and all the ways in which that we are innovating the end of life, and the ways in which that we can experience the end of life with all these new options, like, whether it's just different kinds of cremation, or whatever the things are, or really conceptualizing like the end of life, if they want a living funeral or something, or like how they want to be celebrated or memorialized, legacy, all of that. And then how I would want someone to experience the end of their life is really knowing how they would want to experience that and providing that to them. So really digging deep in, the feelings, sensations, last wishes, um, comfort, anything it is that they would want, because it's not my death, it's like what they would want is the most important, and really trying to meet them there. And a huge component in terms of wanting to share with people of color is to encourage, foster, normalize, have more folks like us showing up, to support them through that, because it's, as we all know, the complexities, the difficulty, the challenges, I mean, severe, just it's heartbreaking to think of how different we can experience death and the end of lives within our world today. And with people of color, oftentimes they're in this lifetime not even told that they're valued, that they matter, that their own wishes matter. They don't have a lot of options or information or resources. So I think, again, having folks like us that maybe they would feel comfortable even talking to, or I don't know, understanding that we even exist is huge, I think, first and foremost. And encouraging them that, yeah, they can have choice, and they can have autonomy, and they can have options, and we can have these hard conversations together, and we can turn on the light switches together, like, I think it's really, really, really important to, one, just first and foremost, let people of color know that we exist, and the ways in which that we can meet them, and that they do matter enough to have these choices. I think is really important.
Actually, I feel like you just have so beautifully threaded it throughout this conversation, which is like, why is your work approaching death care, which is usually the word that people use to like describe what we do, like fits into a box for them. Why is it so complex and coming at this from so many angles? And I think you just very beautifully painted this picture of the fact that, like, yes, there are the practical things that we just have to do and boxes we can tick to make sure that we are set up and the people in our lives are set up. But when you rewind long before you're sitting down to fill out your, to do advanced care planning or things like that, there is so many layers emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually, and rewinding way back into our lineage that make this about so much more than the practical and so much more than planning, which I think is really important to remember. So I'm curious if you have anything else to say about that. Like there's this juxtaposition of like, yes, we need to probably do some practical things to make sure that ourselves and our communities and our families are set up. And also there's some deep work that you are holding people in when you are exploring this space with them.
Yes, thank you for naming all of that, because I guess for me, I don't even talk too much about the practical, because I'm so aware of all of this emotional, maybe even spiritual experience. For me, it's very easy to be very practical. It's very easy for me to check off boxes and do all of that. Like, I think that's the easiest part. And I am so driven in terms of the way in which that we are existing and living our lives and the complexities of it. And so with this very, excuse me, um, broad box of death care, it's like, because life is so complicated, why wouldn't death be a little complicated? And I am so passionate. Like, one of my favorite parts and ways in which I like to meet people in this end of life realm is really at the thresholds of impermanence. So, meaning, perhaps you've already experienced a loss, or maybe you have like a illness, maybe you have nothing at all, and you're just very curious. But it's really this like preparation work of really getting in touch with that impermanence, really getting in touch with mortality and aligning your life in a way in which that reflects that. Because when we do, our values change, the way in which that we want to spend our time changes, all of that changes. So that gives you, quite frankly, an opportunity to be existing and living your life in the way in which that you really wish. And that gives you more time to do that before we're sitting there at, maybe your last day, your last moments, and you're really having to go through all of that. And it's quite frankly a privilege. But we can do that now because we can have these conversations and we can do these contemplations and we can reflect and we can be held by people because it's really what's emerging right now. And so, yes, I think it goes back to just how I grew up and seeing, my mother's life and the way in which that she transitioned and she was so young, and the Eastern influences of impermanence and really, really, really being so in touch with that because we live in a day in which that like we're so distracted, we're so disconnected, we are so far from reaching these really, really, really intimate and precious and meaningful parts of life. And but I think witnessing firsthand with my mother and other people that I know, for us being alive and breathing and with some time, like we can really, 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 really shift the way in which that we experience being alive by just doing that.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I feel like it's so crucial to think about. I don't like the word baggage, but I think the complexity of what it means to even just think about the fact that we're going to die, let alone plan for it and hold that reality in our bodies is so real. It's so real.
Yeah,
Mm.
I do want to also say, like, I think it's been not like a secret vision, but I think it has always been. What I don't really talk about too much is I do dream about a society, a culture, bodies of people that are doing this, that are being in touch with their impermanence, being held through it, being in touch with mortality, and what would life be like if more people were? Because from all the folks that I've worked with, like exploring impermanence and going through some of my offerings, the transformation is incredible. And this is not one of those things where it's like, oh, you're going to do this and your whole life changes, but practically I have watched transformation occur, and having the courage enough to go into these topics and these conversations where people are healing relationships, like reconnecting with family members, like quitting toxic jobs, leaving relationships, opening up to relationships. I mean, so from my experience being so intimate, guiding people through this and the way in which that I offer it, I mean, I dream of what would happen if more people did that. Like, could that cure capitalism? What could emerge? What could happen though if we're really just like, hold on, all of our day-to-day just distractions, like if everything is just broken open, like what, it's liberation work to me, quite frankly.
There is this reality for us doing this work, and for you in particular, like there is something new and innovative and exciting about what this could blossom and turn into. And so I'm here for the dreams. I'm here for all the dreams. I've been hearing a lot of dreams lately about how to hold people in this work in a way that is just going to change at least where we are in the States and how it's being held in a lot of other ways right now. Like to be able to shift that and offer something so different
Mm-hmm.
sounds really badass to me. So I'm here for it and I'm here for the dreams. Thank you. Is there anything else that you feel like you've wanted to share? Anything you haven't been able to share or talk about anywhere else?
Right now in this moment, I just think my mind also now is a little bit on how this life work, this death work really can be liberation work. It really can be life changing for a lot of people.